Welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Cheryl, and I'm one of the volunteers of the Conversation Circles. And today I'd like to talk about our river valley and our river valley parks and some of the trees that we come across when we're in the river valley. And so the river valley is very important to me. In fact, I got married just over there by the river. And I live near the river valley as well, and I'm walking there almost every single day. It's important to me, it's important to my family, and I think it's just a wonderful thing to do. The Japanese call it Shinrin Roku, which just means forest bathing. It's getting out amongst the trees, walking, cycling, whatever it is we do, but just enjoying the presence of trees. So today we're going to take a quick little walk through the forest, as much as we can in this part of the park system, and we're going to learn to identify some of the native species of trees. Are you ready? So, hello again. We're going to talk about some of the native species of trees. So I've put a few special words on here for us to review a little bit later. So the term native species means exactly that. Native means belonging to the land, belonging originally to the land. And a native species, a species is a group of plants or animals that grow in an area, thrive in an area without human care. So many of the trees that we look around in our river valley, in this particular Louise McKinnon Park as an example, are planted trees. They're not native species, but they're trees that do fairly well in the Alberta climate. And so they're planted here because they're very beautiful. But some trees are our native species, and this is an example of one right here. So this is an example of what we call a deciduous tree. Now, deciduous trees are trees with leaves. Basically, that's the term, broadleafed. And so these are leaves that grow in the spring, they advance through the summer, they develop fruit and seeds, and they drop catkins, etc. And then in the fall, they turn color and they fall. And then the tree goes dormant all winter long. And dormant means that it stops its growth cycle. And it needs to drop its growth cycle because the winter is very harsh in this part of the world. And there is no way a tree can keep up that level of growth and that energy needed because the sun is less, we're not photosynthesizing. And so these are called deciduous trees. This is an example of a poplar tree. Now, poplar trees, here's a way to remember it, are one of the most popular trees, meaning that it is a tree that we see everywhere. And there's two kinds of poplars in this area. There's the balsam poplar and the aspen poplar. This is a balsam, and I can tell right away from a distance because it has these long, glossier leaves, and it has a certain trunk, and it just sort of grows everywhere. It just is a tree that is very, 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 very common in Alberta. Okay. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more again about deciduous and coniferous. So one of the ways to identify trees, of course, is the shape. So you've got your triangular shape of a conifer or a coniferous tree, and you've got your trunk and then the rounded part of a deciduous tree. So I'm standing underneath an example of a coniferous tree, which is called a spruce. Now, we have many spruce here in Alberta, but this would be considered a white spruce. And it's coniferous. Let's remember that word cone. So cones meaning it will drop cones below as needed. Now, remembering also the difference between a coniferous is needles. So a coniferous tree will keep its needles all year long, and just dropping them gradually, just like we would drop hairs once in a while, or your dog would shed hair. They drop them very, very gradually all around. But the needle is a great adaptation to our cold winters here in Alberta. And so needles tend to hold their moisture, they hold on to the photosynthesis, and then as soon as the weather starts to warm up in the spring, an evergreen tree or a coniferous tree can start to make food for itself again. Okay, here we are at the funicular. If you've never taken that before, you go to Hotel McDonald, walk down a little bit, and you can take the funicular down into the river valley. Our river valley is one of the most beautiful river valleys in Canada, with over 150 walking trails. And as I pan through, you can see all the different parts. Of course, there's our river, the North Saskatchewan River. Over here, we're going to see construction on an LRT bridge that is happening over towards the Riverdale neighborhood, and then back up the river. Now, when I look down on the trees from this height, I can see the difference between our coniferous and our deciduous trees. So I can see the triangular coniferous trees, I can see the rounder topped deciduous trees. Willow trees, another deciduous tree we'll talk about, loves to be near the river, loves the water at its roots. So does a lot of our other black poplars and our black spruce, love to be near the water. Other trees prefer the heat, prefer the dryness, and they will grow higher on the riverbanks or in the prairies or in the alpine regions of Alberta. All right, here's one of my favorite Alberta trees, my favorite Edmonton trees. It's called a tamarack. This is how we spell it, tamarack. It's interesting because it's really a deciduous conifer. What that means is it belongs to the conifer family. You can see it by its shape, you can see it by its needles, beautiful big long needles, and you can see it by its cones. So it is a conifer, but it acts like a deciduous tree. These needles come bright, brilliant green in the springtime. They stay green all summer, and then they turn a brilliant orangey yellow in the fall, and they drop, and it doesn't have any needles all winter long. And so it's considered a conifer. Again, just reviewing, these are the other types. We have a pine, we have a spruce, and we have tamarack, and they're all conifers. I want to talk for just a second about First Nations. So as we know, First Nations people used trees that were all around them. An example of the use of a tamarack tree makes great firewood, makes great, and it doesn't rot because it loves to be near the water. The wood is very dense. They used the birch tree to make things like birch bark canoes, and for paper, wrapping things up. We use the willow. Here's an example of a willow leaf. We haven't shown you a willow yet, but willows grow near our riverbanks over here. And willows were used because of their pliable branches. They were used to weave baskets and carrying tripods and things like that. And then Saskatoons, which we'll show you if we can too, are an example of an edible tree. So that's a tree that puts out a beautiful little purpley red berry that was used as a staple in especially the Plains people's diet. And then of course the poplar that we've talked about already is the big tall, especially if they could get the tall or the lodgepole pine or whatever they could get a long tall trunk for, they would use it for their poles for their teepees that they would wrap up and travel across Alberta with. So this is our second type of poplar that's in the area. So we talked about the balsam poplar with the big glossy green leaves. This is called the trembling aspen poplar. And so when the wind shakes, as you can see up top, they tremble in the wind. So that's a good way to think about it. And they're little heart-shaped leaves that tremble, 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 tremble. Very common in the river valley. So some parts of the river valley are much wilder than others. So the Louise McKinney Park is obviously a combination of planted and indigenous trees or native species, but a portion of the river valley here in the south of Edmonton has fewer trails, fewer things going on, and of course are going to have more native species, such as the trembling aspen right here. We've got dogwood down below, there's the black spruce, and so on. So we are fortunate enough to have found some Saskatoon berries. They are everywhere in the river valley, but sometimes they get a little overpicked. You can identify them as being very long, slim, bush-like trees, often with a little bit rounder green leaves like this. And as you can see, especially towards the top, the berries are pink when they start off, and then they get this juicy, purpley red. Now, the one thing I do warn anybody about picking berries, unless you're 100% certain about the identification of a tree with its berries, I don't recommend you eat them unless you're certain. I'm quite certain these are Saskatoons, so I have no problems eating them. They're much like a blueberry, but they're smaller, grainier, and I think tastier. Because this is a good example of an invasive species, I'm going to show you up close. This is a tree or bush that you see quite commonly in the river valley, and it's called caragana. But the reason why I didn't want to highlight it as one of our native trees is because it invades. So there's that word, invasive species. Something that was introduced back in the 1930s during the Depression times, in order to stop our soil from flying off the fields in Alberta. We planted caragana hedges across the prairies, and they were very effective for that job. But unfortunately, having been introduced into a city like Edmonton, they take over. So these particular bush trees have begun to take over space where we would have seen poplar, birch, willow, spruce. I'm standing up at the top of the Louise McKinnon Park, up near the convention center, and this is access to the paths down below. As you can see, it's quite a beautiful panorama. I just wanted to share a few books for those of you who might love books or might love trees as much as I do. I'm just going to show you a couple of books that might be impactful for you or your children. So to begin with, there's a book called The Giving Tree. This is a beautiful tree about what trees do for us and what they give us in our lives. And so that's by Cheryl Silverstein, so you can remember that one. Another example for children or for yourself, whichever you care for, is something called Wish Tree. And this is a beautiful story you could read aloud to your children, talking about how a tree contributes to a whole community. It's a beautiful story. And then I mentioned earlier when we were filming the idea of forest bathing. So forest bathing is the idea of, just being down in the park system, being amongst the trees, feeling the coolness, looking up, looking at the greens, and just allowing it to give you some peace and healing. And then one of my favorite adult books of all times about trees is The Hidden Life of Trees. This was originally done in German and then translated to English, and it explains it to the average person what truly remarkable beings trees are, and you might find it to be a good read.
Love.